Hello everyone, this is Space with part 2 of my spacecraft designs for Kerbal Space Program 1.12 with realism overhaul. So these are parts that I made in Blender specifically for Kerbal Space Program, though they were made as realistically as possible with as many considerations built in as possible, and I tried to make them as legit as I could. In the previous video, I focused mainly on nuclear things, or things related to my nuclear missions with NTRs, nuclear thermal rockets. But in this case, I want to focus on the space planes. And the first we have here is probably the oldest one. It is the Shuttle 2. The Shinkansen might be older, but not the current iteration of the Shinkansen, which I've updated. So the Shuttle 2 has many interesting features. First of all, it is meant as a smaller shuttle with a full cargo bay. It's somewhat related to the Max space plane from the Soviet Union. It, in fact, also has the retractable wings, even though you can't really do that and place the procedural control surfaces on. You'll know it doesn't have a vertical stabilizer. It's supposed to. It's supposed to have vertical stabilizer and control surfaces here, but I use procedurals for those. So they're not part of the parts that I made. But in the back, it has a small service module with MMH and Mon 3. And then in order to go to the moon, what it would do is it would fit hydrogen, oxygen tanks inside the cargo bay in order to get enough delta V to go to the moon. And then it would add small hydrolox engines on the tail for that. These are just gaps, so you can put any engine you want in there. And normally I'd put BE7s or something like that. And then it could transfer to the moon and then use the RCS and this MMH and Mon 3 to capture around the moon and then depart and come back. And then the goal was for it to be able to aerobrake back at Earth before landing. I ultimately found out that it would take a lot of aerobraking passes for this to actually do that. But yeah. Now you might be curious about these things. Well, those are abort motors. And you can see the sort of silver thing here. That's the decoupler. So it can separate off from this line, from all that, and abort. So this, of course, can't launch itself. It attaches to a launch vehicle. It would have some sort of adapter like this. Well, anyway, I might have to reconsider that fit. Anyway, some sort of decoupler, some sort of adapter for the launch vehicle, and at its current mass, it could fit on a bunch of launch vehicles. It's 25 tons, but if it had the big tanks in the bay to go to the moon, then that would limit which launchers it could be on. Maybe New Glenn could launch it, but maybe not. It might need something more than that even. So anyway, abort motors. The abort motors drop off during launch, so those are decouplers. So after it's safe, it'll shoot those off, so it doesn't need to carry those the whole time. And of course, they wouldn't survive re-entry anyway. That it is a problem if the wings are extended. So I mean, because the abort motors could collide with the wing. So normally it would be retracted, but at this time, and even right now, I'm not entirely sure I can make the control surfaces in such a way that FAR will understand how they're supposed to go when there's a retracting. Somebody else has made a retracting lifting surface, I know, but I've never been able to do that. So anyway, its main feature is the abort cabin and it being smaller than the normal shuttle. Now, I did decide to make a more complicated thing, and that was the Taurus. The Taurus was deliberately meant to be a competitor to Orion, and it has a fairly light cabin, but it's also a very small cabin compared to the shuttle cabin. It's like one floor of the shuttle instead of two, so it carries at most 4 people. But then, instead of having a cargo bay, it has no cargo bay. So this is it is a pressurized compartment that the Kerbals can walk through, but then you can see that the sides are sort of blocked off, and that's because they have the tanks from the space shuttle. Those are the OMS tanks, and so it's supposed to use the OMS engines, which I don't even know if I've got in here right now. But the AJ-10-190s, these guys, well, they won't fit this is not a good model of it anyway. But there is a better model that fits exactly with that. And so that's what it's meant. It's basically taking the OMS tanks from the space shuttle, putting them in a space plane, a smaller space plane, and then using that in the same capacity as Orion. And this came with its own wings, left wing, right wing, but still I didn't build the control surfaces in, so we would need procedural control surfaces. There is the raising out of the outer wing possible here. I made it do that, and then it's also got vertical stabilizers that are custom. But I think I left the body flap. I don't know if I intended a body flap. Maybe I didn't. It's been a while since I used this, but the rudder was kept off because I just used a procedural part for that. So no cargo bay, but it's meant to do everything that Orion would do. And with the proper engines, let me just slap these on, just so we can see. They'll still have the same numbers, if not the same look, as the ones I would normally use. Oh, do they not? Oh, they need high pressure tank. Oh, it changed that from the old days. Yeah. Well, I'll need to identify this as a high pressure tank. I mean, the shuttle tanks were high pressure tanks. I just didn't bother to identify it because the old AJ-10-190s did not require that. But anyway, it would get actually more delta V than Orion does. It's 31 tons at launch, and when we take out the fuel, this is fuel cell propellant, it's 17.8 tons. So hefty enough to be legit. These would probably be tilted out. And it's called a Taurus because Taurus was what Orion fought against. Same idea as the Shuttle 2 in that it's going to try to aerobrake when coming back. But I do feel that it might need too many passes, or it might be okay. The problem is the radiation belts. You don't want to pass through them too many times. Okay, so that's the Taurus. Next is a completely different kind of spaceplane. It's not really a spaceplane. It's more of a space wedge. It's like a flying fairing, but it normally does have procedural wings on it. I just don't have those on right now. So it'd be fitted with some, not like this, but it'll have some wings to control itself. And they'll be relatively small. But what this is a Mars lander. We saw some lunar landers last time. The Maru-Q is a Mars lander, and it had numerous features like these rotating nozzles for its engines, so that I can land, so that I can land like this. But then when it takes off, it also has gaps for engines back here. But the skis had this fancy feature where they lower like this, so that when it takes off like that. So it gets lifted up. I tested this, but it's a little bit iffy. Obviously, we have to close the hatch. And these will be rotated like this. They're actually, the engines themselves are tilted out, so they're not aimed at each other. It's still a little bit iffy, I felt, ultimately. And it lifts off like this before retracting the skis. And that's to minimize the drag that it might have. It's pretty heavy though. As you can see, 66 tons, not a whole lot can get it over. I mean, it'll have to get itself over to, get itself over to Mars. It's all backwards. Get itself over to Mars beforehand. So that's not ideal. It's got 4,029, which is sort of not enough. And because it wasn't enough delta V ultimately, I made these additional tanks that could be fit into the bay. It's a pretty luxurious, volume in there, but they'll be put right at the center of mass so that they don't disturb anything. That's another thing about this arrangement, is that the center of mass is very finicky, and these have to be properly balanced. We would have to thrust limit them in order to maintain the balance, so that's a bit annoying. But yeah, I really didn't need all this space, as it turns out. And if we put this at the center of mass, that means any cargo that we want to roll out, like a base module, for instance, was probably the intention. That means that the base module has to be aft, and then that throws off the balance. So that's not great either. So, but it was meant to drop base modules on the surface, and that was my hope. But I decided it wasn't ideal for that. It was also rather big. Things would have trouble getting it over to Mars. It doesn't really have its full... I guess I'll have to put a pipe on here. Oh, right. It uses methane and oxygen, but these were meant for the Hydrolox version. There is a Hydrolox version, and that's the lunar one. Because on the moon... Let me just get the lunar one here. On the moon, you can't get methane. So this one is actually hydrogen and oxygen and uses those. That's what it was. But still, I don't like the delta V of the Maru-Q by default. Mass here always reads something completely wrong. But let me see. Let's dump all the hydrogen and oxygen. 17 tons. But that's just the front end. That's the... Yeah, okay, it is a 6-ton front end. Okay. Still, might be a little bit optimistic. I felt even with 17-ton mass, this was sort of optimistic. So I created an overall smaller one. And the smaller one was appropriately named the Mini-Q instead of the Maru-Q. This is all still going with my theme of Japanese names that can be counted as numbers. Maru-Q can stand in for 09. But the Mini-Q doesn't. Mini-Q is just a really small 9. Maru-Q can mean other things. It's somewhat redundant because Maru is round and Q ball. So it could mean round ball, which isn't really the shape of it. But if you had a sphere, that would be a really good name for a sphere, Maru-Q. But anyway, it was sort of a funny name. But the one that's for the moon is Usagi. That means that's a rabbit. It's specifically the lunar rabbit. Anyway, Mini-Q was smaller. Let me see if I can put it on in a sensible way. You can see it's much more streamlined, it's shorter, and so easier to launch without some really big launcher, and it has a less dry mass. It also has its ISRU unit built in. That's something that this didn't have. It didn't have the ISRU built in. But if we look inside, there's less space. Some tankage is built into here. On the Maru-Q, all the tankage is actually in these bits near the engines. But here, and there was enough volume, here some of the tankage is built into here, and so are the ISRU units. It's also all one parts to make it easier on me to maintain the balance during re-entry. It's got its own engine blocks, which are like this. And they're in a different position than on the Maru-Q, you'll note. It's a tighter thing to avoid having to adjust them too much. Yeah, whether we need that cargo space, it could probably still have a base module in there and roll it out. But then, again, we'll have to manage to balance properly. It does have its skis as well. But yeah, it was just meant to be a smaller one so that we can launch it easier. It also has sort of a nicer nose to it. This is a more eagle sort of nose, and this is a more streamlined sort of nose. Because it was called the Mini-Q after the Maru-Q, I ultimately truncated to Miku, and that's somewhat of a reference to Vocaloid. So I gave it its paint job based on Vocaloid's Miku. Not that I'm not a wild fan, I just thought it would be cute. We get 4,400 meters per second almost, 42 tons, 12 tons dry. Still probably optimistic. So, that was the Miku. And then, more recently, I decided to make the Mars Star. Well, actually, before the Mars Star, I should introduce sort of something completely different, and that is the Mini Star and the Orion. Okay, yeah, well, this one is really messed up, because I've moved things. But originally what I wanted was the Orion 3 spaceplane from 2001: A Space Odyssey. And I wanted to launch it the way it was supposed to be launched, which was on the back of a carrier plane. So this is the Pan Am spaceplane from 2001: A Space Odyssey. I made it with seats. Unfortunately, because I reconfigured it, the nodes for where everything is, including where the seats are, have moved. The reason for that is because the cockpit, if you want an IVA, you have to make sure that the cockpit is at 0, 0. So that means that the whole thing needs to have a center of mass offset. So the original model I had, the 0, 0 point was at the center of mass, the real center of mass of where the spaceplane's center of mass would be. But if you want an IVA, the IVA is automatically placed at 0, 0. So then I had to move the model and make sure that the cockpit area was at 0, 0, and then have a center of mass offset to tell it where the center of mass is in relation to that. So the new version, I put the cockpit in and offset it, but the nodes are still in the wrong place on this particular craft file. Okay, ignore the seats and anything else that's hanging out where it's not supposed to be. The idea is that the Orion 3 spaceplane rides on the back of this Orion 3 carrier plane. The carrier plane lands downrange, and I figured that out exactly how far it could go. Here we have procedural wings on everything, but ultimately I made standard wings for the carrier plane for it to use, so I had specific parts for that. And here we have food, water, and oxygen still in here as if it was piloted, which was... So back in when 2001 A Space Odyssey was made in 1969, one of the ideas for the space shuttle was to have this sort of arrangement where both things would be piloted. There would be a carrier plane and the space plane. And so Stanley Kubrick sort of picked up on that idea for the space shuttle and used it for this and for 2001 A Space Odyssey. And that's what this arrangement is. That's why it has cockpit windows, because it would have been piloted too, and it would land downrange. In my case, I launched them out of Tampico and would land the carrier plane at the Bahamas, because that ended up being convenient, and then the space plane would continue on. Both contribute about 4,000 meters per second to the deal. And I decided that the best thing to use would be methane and oxygen, instead of hydrogen and oxygen. The originals were meant to use hydrogen and oxygen, but I couldn't figure out how to fit enough hydrolox into the space plane while still leaving room for the seats, because it has a lot of room for passengers and not a whole lot of room for the propellant. So that caused a bit of a problem. Now, it doesn't have to be balanced on launch, so having it with a really heavy tail is fine as long as you don't intend for it to abort. If it needed to abort, it would have to dump that fuel rather quickly. Otherwise, it is aerodynamically imbalanced. It needs to be basically empty in the back in order for it to come back down. That is the Orion carrier plane in its original purpose, and that's why it's called the Orion carrier plane. However, after making Venture Star, I made a Venture Star replica. I decided that I could put a smaller version of Venture Star as a second stage on the Orion carrier plane, and I wouldn't have to rework the aerodynamics very much. So I did that. So this is the Mini Star. The Mini Star is a smaller Venture Star with 2 or 3 of these RS-1000 Mini Star engines with about 1,163 kilonewtons, 455 second ISP, which is really good and everything. Really doesn't need the sea level ISP in particular because it doesn't light them low anyway. Whether it needs aerospikes or not is sort of a toss-up, but Venture Star had the aerospikes, so I went with it. Since it's not SSTO anymore, it doesn't really need those in that shape. But we still use methane and oxygen in the Orion carrier plane. I use my own Rex engines, which have these stats, 2,346 kilonewtons. They're somewhere in between the BE4s and Raptors as far as efficiency is concerned, and they're physically larger than Raptors and heavier. 2.4 tons, whatever it is. Raptor 3s, I think I upgraded them once they talked about Raptor 3s because the Raptor 3s were too good. So that is the setup. We've got Hydrolox upper stage, Methalox 4, and this was meant to carry 45 tons to low Earth orbit. And so I don't know if we have a... In fact, it is only 40 tons, but it can do 45. And then both stages are recoverable. So that's great. And then comes the Mars star. The Mars star is an enlarged mini-star, and it's not carrying a payload anymore. The payload mass, the 45 tons, is built in now to allow it to carry a cockpit because the mini-star is automated, just like Venture Star was. There's no crew. And it is meant to be a Mars lander. The benefits of it over the other things, the Maru Q and the Mini Q, is that it has a front-loading ramp. And with that ramp, it means that the payload is placed in the center of the craft instead of in the back. And it has more room for fuel, so we don't have to have those internal fuel tanks. So this is the cargo bay, padded for Kerbal safety. And so we have the fuel alongside, and it has plenty of room for the propellant. So we don't have to worry about that. It's still got the mini-star engines, just 2 in this case, more than enough, really. And then it has these large wings that were made for the mini-star originally. The result of this is a lot more surface area to allow it to create drag to slow down around Mars, but I still have to test that. In order to land on Mars, though, you don't know that it doesn't have those swiveling engines. Instead, we have engine flaps and the engines built into here. Now, that makes it a little bit harder to get them to maintain the balance properly, and I'll have to see about that. But yeah, we've got the landing engines there. It's all hydrolocks all the way in this case for the Mars star. And let us close the ramp and the flaps. So that's a further development on the whole deal. And then the Mars star would make orbit. It'd have some fuel to spare after it makes orbit, but then it'll get topped off by whatever ship transfers it, or it could transfer itself to Mars, and then it can refuel around Mars if necessary and then land. So that is the Mars star idea. We are back in the SPH for the next space plane, and that is the Scram Spike. That is a combination of a scramjet and aerospikes. And the logic behind this was I realized that the curvature of an aerospike like these sort of matched the exit curvature of a scramjet. Basically, the scramjet has a divergent nozzle at the end, or divergent funnel, whatever you want to call it. And so we have the scramjet down here, and it matches that curve of the aerospikes, and I thought that that was a good way to go. They're clipping a little bit here, but we'll set that aside for now. There's actually also a jet ramjet here, because this is meant to be an SSTO, single stage to orbit spaceplane, and it's pulling out all the stops. In fact, it's the jet ramjet that's the most optimistic part of this whole deal, and that's because I don't know if you can get this much thrust out of this mass of jet ramjet. And the reason I don't know is because it's a hydrogen jet ramjet, and we don't have a whole lot of jet ramjets that run off of hydrogen. It's hard to handle, and so they haven't made many. They mostly run off of some form of jet fuel, kerosene, that sort of thing. And it has 2 modes, one for the normal jet mode that gets up to Mach 2.2, and then the the ramjet mode that gets up to Mach 4.5-ish. So it's not that great in that respect, but and of course it's got lower efficiency in the ramjet mode, but probably it should have even lower. But again, it's hard to figure out with the hydrogen how good it can be. But it basically has the stats that it needs to have. The scramjet is not super. It's middling as far as the theoretical scramjets go. It's got 2 modes. It's got one that gets to about Mach 10, and the second one can push it to Mach 12. The second one, of course, is less efficient than the first one. And it just takes in air and throws hydrogen at it in its scramjet-y way. It's fairly heavy at 12 tons. And so it's slung at the bottom of the spaceplane, and then we have the aerospikes. These are modifications of the same ones I've been using on the Venture Star and Mini Star. They get 1,400 kilonewtons, 455 seconds ISP. Sea level never happens anyway, really. And so yeah, they're there. and most of the body is filled with the hydrogen, and then we have a cockpit up front, and there's not much else. Well, that docking port doesn't fit exactly great right now, but yeah, there's not much room for anything on here. It's just supposed to carry crew, and that's what makes it work as an SSTO. If it had to carry payload, yeah, I don't know. If it had to carry payload, then it would be in trouble. Which brings us to the modifications of it. Also note where the nose gear is. We can't really put the nose gear that far in front because of where the scramjet is. So the nose gear is here. It manages to work, but it's not the greatest thing in the world. But as long as it's in front of the center of mass, it's okay. But that is the default Scram spike, and then we have other modifications. So I decided it'd be interesting to be able to take the Scram spike off and instead have an ISRU conversion. And so now it's not a Scram spike anymore, it's just got the ramjet getting to a Mach 5 and then the aero spikes pushing it the rest of the way. As a result, it's going to need some help, some boost, and there are multiple ways of doing that. But here, in the place of the scramjet, we instead have landing engines. So now it can do the same thing as the mini star, and I've tested this out, and land on the moon. Actually, this is meant for the moon rather than Mars. And then drill to replenish itself, and then lift off again. Oh, and I said that it was filled with hydrogen. It's mainly filled with hydrogen, but of course this aerospikes need oxygen, so it does have oxygen in the body there. Varying amounts, having to get the exact right mix of hydrogen and oxygen is very difficult. But you can see the oxygen volume is very small compared to the hydrogen volume. Anyway, but we do have to refuel on the moon, and there we would drill for hydrogen and oxygen. We'll drill for water and convert it to hydrogen and oxygen. The ISRU drill, this one goes here-ish. I can't get the rotations right. Well, somewhere around there, there's a drill. Okay, and then we have power generated by a small nuclear reactor back there. I don't know how safe that would be, but it's what we've got there. The vent there is actually for Mars. If we wanted to take in the carbon dioxide, that is to intake the carbon dioxide there. Though I guess we could intake them from the main intakes too if we wanted to. So that is the ISRU conversion for the Scram spike. And now it's not a Scram spike anymore, and I normally refer to this version as just the Asuka spaceplane. As a result of that, though, I needed to think about the balance of everything, and the cargo version is one that actually uses 3 propellants. The idea here being that if we have methane, hydrogen, and oxygen, that's denser. It's not more efficient, it's denser. And the density allows me to have a cargo bay. A very small cargo bay, but still a cargo bay. And the downside is that it's way heavier because of the lack of efficiency. Instead of 300 tons, we're looking at clearly nearly 500 tons here, and I haven't even fit everything else on it. So then it really can't take off on its own at all, and so it's not an SSTO for sure. It needs some sort of boost, and one option for a boost is a rocket sled, which I had, but that's not a spacecraft, so I won't talk about it in this video. But I did make a rocket sled, and that is an option for launching the Asuka spaceplane. So anyway, the cargo bay version requires the triple propellant engines, and that adds density but kills the mass. That is the sum total of that. That's the only actual SSTO I've made as far as one that I've designed. And I went through the numbers in a different video where I broke down the dry mass of the Asuka spaceplane to show that it was possible to actually have it be the SSTO. The tricky thing is the jet ramjets. That's the iffiest thing about it. Okay, so the spaceplane that people most know me for, I guess we'll go to the VAB for it. is this spaceplane, or pair of spaceplanes. This is the Shinkansen. The Shinkansen, in Japanese Shinkansen, it just means the new trunk line. It's their bullet train. And so it was meant to be a bullet train in space, was what the Shinkansen system was supposed to be. Those windows are a little bit too transparent. But one side is a spaceplane, the other side is a carrier plane. They're identical, except this side doesn't have any cockpit and is filled with fuel. So here, the fuel is in front and in the back. Here, the fuel is only in the back, not in the front. And in the middle here, I created an abort pack. The original Shinkansen did not have an abort pack. This does. And so the front end can separate and then use these abort engines here. And then it has parachutes fitted. Unfortunately, my goal with the upgraded Shinkansen was to have it have more cargo capacity, but then I did this stupid thing where I put the abort pack and that killed the cargo pack capacity again. So, yeah, I might have made a mistake with the whole abort thing. It does have bay doors. That's its bay. It's not very big. It's sort of like the Scram Spike as well. But it does have this bay with little tugs inside and fuel cells and fuel cell fuel, and then a docking port there. That's what it's got right now. And the RCS is placed here and not in the nose. And that's the original Shinkansen had the RCS in the nose, but then I realized that the nose is way too far in front compared to the center mass, which is back here somewhere because all the tankage is here. So it's better to have the RCS evenly split around that center of mass. The front end has plenty of center of mass, but everything is pretty heavy in the back here most of the time. And another problem is feeding the fuel to the front added mass. So if you have the RCS thrusters here, you have to have fuel lines going all the way. And so that was a downside. So I cut some mass by just not having the fuel lines go all the way. So you can see the procedural canards, but the main wings are made by me, and they have the control surfaces built in. I'm using the same, modified Rex engines from the ones on the Orion carrier plane. These are smaller and vacuum, and so they get more ISP. They're the same model, so I've cheated because I wanted, and I've got sea level ones, Rex Minis. So on the carrier plane, there's only Rex Minis that are sea level. On the space plane, there's 2 sea level, 2 vacuum. So it's like that. You can see the Rex Minis have a modest 360-second ISP on liftoff, and there's a total of 8 engines helping us lift off. The vacuum ones have a vacuum nozzle, but they're not super vacuum. 298 seconds of ISP at sea level is possible. So, it is a pair of spaceplanes that share body characteristics, making it easier to make, and they can launch like this. This would land downrange somewhere. That I have never actually done, by the way. The decoupler between them is discarded, so it's sort of like the interstage ring on Super Heavy. It's just dumped. So that part is not reusable. Otherwise, that is the newer version of the Shinkansen that I have, and I have not put it to as much use as the older version, actually, the one without the abort system. But normally what happened was the older version, and probably this newer version right now, carried recoverable boosters. They were boosters with parachutes, basically, and those were slapped on the top of them in order to give it a boost so that I can actually have some payload capacity. But otherwise, the Shinkansen was designed very, very tightly, and too tightly to get exactly the delta V it needed to get to orbit, that I never accounted for the cargo. So that was always a problem with it. Anyway, that is a Shinkansen. Looks good. Perhaps a little bit on the longish side, but I have put it to use and it has come back down. And coming back down is iffy because even this version is aerodynamically very touchy depending on how much fuel is left over in the back. So we have to have like exactly the right amount left over for the RCS control for it to come back down. So it's never been my favorite to actually operate with. Some of the others I've been much happier with. The mini star derived ones I've always been happier with. They do re-enter safely without any tweaking, and so it was good copying Venture Star. Venture Star was a good thing to copy. So now that clears up all the shuttle stuff. There are a few honorable mentions. One was the spin ship, which I've recently made. So this was meant to wrap around, well, I mean SLS mainly, but it could be some other launcher like the KSP rocket, and wrap around the core of it so that the core of the rocket would sit here and then there would be boosters on the opposite side, and then this whole ship would launch like this and then extend itself once it reached orbit, and then it would be able to spin to generate artificial gravity and stuff like that. And over on this side we have the radiators. It could tuck fuel in here on the truss, and it could have engines or a docking port on this side and on this side, and people would be able to live inside of it, and as it rotates it would generate artificial gravity such that this end and that end over there were the floors. And so that's just a quick little mention of a design to make use of large central stages like the core stage of SLS that would omit the upper stage of SLS in that case. And then there's the OMSAT system. This is a satellite system, and we can actually go into the VAB instead of using the, what is that thing called again? Hangar extender. Instead of using hangar extender, we can go in here because it is fairly small. And what it is the little stage that you extend the solar panel, and you can see it's a stage that can use multiple kinds of engines. I think I sized the tank so that it'd be hydrolox. So it's been a long time since I used this, but BE7s would work because it's meant to be hydrolox. And then this could transfer stuff to higher orbits. You can see the solar panels there, and it's got RCS built in using the MH and NTO. And then what happens is we have a stacker, and then we have these satellites. And these satellites get the little engines on, but I won't put the engines on yet. So they go like this, and then one stack can have 4 of these satellites, and they have the dish, the core, and their own little propellant. And then you extend the solar panels like that, and the solar panels get their power like that. So it's got the RCS sort of blowing out the solar panels a little bit, and then can fit one of these engines down here. So the engines do go along with it. It's got a little engine aperture in the tail. And so that it was my ComSat. If you ever wondered, do I ever do ComSat? This was my ComSat system, using the transfer stage to get them to higher orbits and deploy them to 4 or 8 or however many you want very quickly. It's not very heavy. These satellites are modest, 0.5 ton satellites. And then I haven't put the fuel in the stage yet. If we put the, well, let's say BE7 like I said. With the BE7, we fill it with BE7 fuel, and we see 3,205 meters per second with the stage. So that could get it to geosynchronous transfer orbit, and then these guys, the satellites themselves, could circularize there, hopefully. I'll put it there. Yeah, they could circularize. Just about right. 1,544 would do the deal for circularizing at geosync with the spare fuel. It only needs 2,400 to boost up, and then it could phase using the rest. So it could deploy them all to geosynchronous orbits and have them all 4 be apart. And so that was the OMSAT system. I probably released it at some point, if you're wondering, but I don't remember where. So those were all my not all my spacecraft. The stuff I've probably made other things too, but those are the ones that I remember for now. And that has been an updated catalog of the little ideas, and I'll leave it here. So for now, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do press like. If you have any comments or suggestions, please leave them in the comment section below, and I'll see you next time.